Um, Wonderful. Hi, everyone. My name is Charlene Chen, and I'm one of the co-founders of Operations Nation. If you're not familiar with Operations Nation, we're a digital content and global hub and community designed to really be a one-stop shop for operations professionals in startups and scale-ups to connect with each other and to find all the resources that help them to survive and thrive in their operations careers. We have been running a series of events called Conversations, which are essentially a focus on interesting topics that are related to our operations careers. And today we have the pleasure of hosting a conversation with Janie Links, who is the founder of High Calibre People. And we'll hear a bit more about her background, including at Google and at Trainline. But today's conversation is really focused on how to be a chief people officer in absentia. Essentially, if your company doesn't have a chief people officer, and you should find yourself as a COO or another operations leader in the role of really shepherding the culture of your company and really looking after people strategy and people operations. So this conversation is really from the lens of being an operations professional who may have oversight of people operations, either informally or formally. So I'm really excited about the conversation today. Just a bit of housekeeping to let y'all know, please use the Q&A function to ask questions throughout the event. I'm going to be mostly driving this conversation as more of a fireside chat with Janie, but I will definitely be integrating any of your questions alongside the conversation. So just as a reminder, please use the Q&A function and not the main chat function. Okay, great. So Janie, a huge welcome. We are so excited to be having this conversation with you, and I want to give a special shout out to our community member, Michal Karnevad, who introduced us. And we'd love to just get started by getting to know you instead of jumping right into the topic. Love for you to share, how did you get to be where you are today? We'd love to hear more about your professional journey and how you knew that people leadership was something that you wanted to focus on.
Sure. Well, listen, thanks a lot to Michal and for you for having me. I'm always excited to share with the network about my lessons that I've learned and some of my paths. So I hope it's going to be of some interest. From a career point of view, my career has had clear patterns, but they've never really been intentional in the sense that it's been quite an opportunistic career, partly linked to my personality in not wanting to finitely plan every single aspect. So like many people that start off an executive search, they never really intend to start off an executive search, they sort of fall into it. That was no different with me. But the exec search work that I did over the first years of my career, I was fortunate enough to be a search partner to many of the early internet companies. So for eBay.com, as it was called back then, and Tesco.com as the first grocery retailer in the UK as it was being launched. And really quite early on, I became very familiar with working with analytical, logical, commercial, ambitious types. And that, in a way, set the quality talent bar for what I thought was relatively normal in terms of, well, this is how people work in tech. So that was it was a great benchmark. And as the growth of the internet took off, this is early 2000s. Not going to talk about age at all, but early 2000s. I joined Google when Google only had 200 people in the London office. It wanted to do this direct sourcing thing in-house, like it was getting inundated with applications, and I thought, oh, hang on, how do I go and attract the talent that I want to go after, and not just respond to the incoming through their website and obviously the growth of their brand that they were getting. So I was part of that early in-house recruiting team where we shaped the roles, the profiles. We worked with super smart leaders, and I stayed at Google for about 3 years until it got to about 1,000 people, when the balance of really the balance of organizational structure started to be centralized over in Mountain View. And for me, I'm someone who likes to have impact. So decided that for me, I felt that once you mastered how to hire at Google, I mean, which was a huge learning and challenge and everything that went with it, actually, I wanted something more and another challenge. So I went into a known fintech at the time, where it had a huge mission, huge growth from 200 to about 700, but we took it back to 100 when the business had all sorts of challenges. So from a transformational point of view, that was super interesting. And fortuitously for me, actually, I was shoulder tapped to join a business called Trainline. And at that stage, I had never heard of Trainline. I realized it was selling rail tickets. Why on earth would I want to join a business that was selling rail tickets? You know, isn't that not for train geeks? And actually realizing they wanted to shift the whole focus of the business to become an e-commerce player, which is obviously the world that I knew. KKR had invested in the business. This was back in 2015, and they wanted to, as I describe it, take the business from being working, but under the bonnet, some of the piping was a bit rusty because it'd been around for about 15 years prior at the time that I joined, and take it right through on an incredible growth journey, which was obviously a pleasure to be part of, right into post IPO. And that was scaling the business from about 250 people to about 700 during my tenure there. I was looking after talent and majority of HR amongst other colleagues. And we say that when you think, well, 250 to 700, actually, we were hiring about 250 to 300 people year on year because of the change that we were driving. And that was hopefully managed attrition and everything that goes with that, which I'm happy to share about, but it was a very much a change culture and transformational business. But knowing that we were coming to the IPO, I mean, naturally one thinks about, okay, what's the next step internally, externally? And I loved Trainline, but I had this burning ambition to really, as I'd been thinking about even 10 years earlier, to actually set up my own business. For a couple of reasons, and maybe coming to your question on how did I know people leadership was for me. Internally and externally, I see that leaders are naturally challenged by their people issues because it's hard. Every person's different. So actually, I wanted to help them externally with all the lessons I've learned over 3 scaling and transformational journeys, with helping them really be great at their people stuff, and however broad that might be. So people leadership was for me when I realized that the business was about problem solving with people. So I'll pause there.
Amazing. Oh, I love that. I think people leadership, or I guess people as a function, has kind of been associated with HR, but it's really like it's evolved to be so much more, which is why I think we're seeing so many leaders of all shapes and sizes really pay attention to the importance of people strategy and people operations. And it seems like you've done that as well.
Yeah. Just go on. Sorry, Charlene, sorry.
Oh, yes. I was just going to go a little further and ask you, what are some of the biggest lessons you've learned during your career, through these various high growth companies, and then bringing you to where you are today? How have you found that transition from these kinds of in-house, so to speak, leadership roles to running your own business, which is now about empowering other people leaders?
So look, I mean, working in tech is tough, right? I mean, it's tough, but it's also incredibly rewarding, I think, emotionally and professionally. I definitely, I mean, I will challenge anybody that says they've not got a shed load of lessons that they've learned. But for me, I think there's certainly a couple of them. One is the intensity that comes with working in tech, can hit you front and center if you're not prepared for it. And from the workload to the intensity to the resilience that's required, I guess one of the key lessons I learned was the importance of focusing and managing my energy and my time well, and finding my flow at work. So all the stuff that we've seen in many written books, But when for me, I started to put it into practice, really getting a sense of control over your day when you don't think you have control over your day, I think was a game changer for me. So it's tough to manage daily and even now externally, because I work, with a whole number of different businesses. So there's quite a lot of context switching. That's definitely key. I mean, anecdotally, I don't know if people know about, there's a company, I should plug them because it's them who taught me, called the Energy Project. Google used them, Trainline brought them in, but they really talked about your energy levels with your ultradian rhythm, and the fact that you can work for a 90-minute concentrated period before physiologically we dip. So this idea that you're going to have a 2-hour meeting, you're not going to have everybody concentrating for that amount of time. So those sorts of tips are really helpful for me in one of the lessons I've learned. I think the other one was to move from certainly in HR and people from being a reactive function to a proactive function. So prioritizing what you want to do and why you want to do it and communicating that, again, was a bit of a game changer, because incoming people issues will never stop, ever. Right, it's just constant. And then the final thing for me, both certainly during my people leadership days, was the importance of data, which as I see overlooked quite a lot in earlier stage businesses in particular. So I thought it was worth calling out on this call today.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for that intro, Janie. It sounds like you've learned a lot in your career, and I think that's why we're so excited for you to share some of your experiences and the trends that you're seeing in the organizations with which you work. So to kick off our kind of interactive dialogue and get into the topic, I'd love to just start off by asking you to define, and this is something that we're constantly doing in operations, like how do you define people strategy / people operations? What's the makeup or structure of a people team? I'll just start there, maybe with the definition, and then it would be helpful because we know that we have attendees who are working at smaller organizations, like maybe 20 people or less, up to bigger ones that might be 200 plus. So it'd be great also to recognize that we have a diverse audience. And so it might be helpful to call out like how the definition structure of a team evolves as your company grows.
It changes. So of course I'm smiling because this is an advisory topic in itself, right? But for sure, if I can try and summarize. So maybe stating the obvious, but the people team and the function of the people team is to enable everything that's people related to deliver the business strategy. It has to be entirely connected. If it's not, the function will rarely move out of an old school administrative function. So whether the team has a plan or not, which maybe we'll come on to talk about, actually, in terms of the definition of the people or HR team, I see two trends in the market just now, and I think in our early calls we talked on this because of course you're operations nation and that people operations. Actually, the two trends that the two trends or definitions around is people operations historically was defined as the HR operations, the foundational layer you would build in the HR function to help with building out an employee handbook and policy process, employee relations, administration function, all the operational aspects of HR. I was going to say historically is called people operations. Actually, to some extent today it still is, if I talk to people colleagues, but there is a shifting trend to have a broader look and labeling perhaps around people operations, notwithstanding that actually some chief people officers, and hopefully said in the right spirit, are starting to move into COO roles. So actually the worlds are merging in terms of the language, but historically people operations, and how I still loosely refer to it, is that HR operations foundational. The traditional HR manager and the work that they would do would be people ops. But in the people team, the people team to deliver the business strategy, full end to end, would comprise of talent acquisition, business partnering, these are in terms of role functions, HR operations, as mentioned, talent development, learning and development, rewards, engagement, internal comms. So all the levers that you need together to service your internal customers, which are the employees, and the leaders of the business to deliver what the business needs to deliver. And there's lots of nuances to your point around the size of business as to what you might need when, which maybe we'll come on to talk about.
Amazing. I know, I think that this is really, really comprehensive. And I think sometimes so you spoke about people leaders becoming COOs. What inspired this conversation is myself, and I wonder if there's others who are attending this call today, who have been COOs that suddenly find themselves either responsible for people operations or feeling really, motivated and inspired to play a role in people strategy and people operations, because we realize that in startups, our greatest asset is our human capital. And so if we're not really looking after the welfare of our, employees, then we have no hopes to achieve the goals that we want to. But yeah, it's big. And I think that's why it's challenging, because if you are a COO, you're also thinking about a lot of other things, or you may be managing other functions. So I think it's really helpful to talk about this. Okay, well, so one of the important sets of relationships that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is really around the leadership team, or exec team, as it's called in some startups. And these questions are coming from an experience myself, and what we're hearing in our communities, that often some of the most challenging relationships and some of the most important inflection points for driving growth and positive change in your startup happens at the leadership team. But often, because we're human beings and it's a stressful environment and we have big ambitious goals, but have different ways of achieving them, there can be a lot of dysfunction in a leadership team. So I'd love to just kick it off. Like, how do we as operations leaders, so assume, COOs or other heads of ops or directors of ops, how are we supposed to help create, functional leadership teams where, sometimes we may be a co-founder, but we're not the CEO. We may see some of our peers kind of behaving dysfunctionally, maybe into dysfunctional behaviors because we're caught up in it all. Like, I just love to hear, is it about like just being an inspirational person? Is it like helping the CEO to really drive roles and responsibilities, driving conversations? Like, if there isn't a chief people officer, but you don't necessarily see your CEO driving this as an agenda, how would you advise us to get involved and be supportive in driving forward a helpful, non-dysfunctional leadership behavior?
Yeah, well, the optimist in me says that I rarely see teams that are entirely dysfunctional. So the good news is that most teams, hopefully through their forming, storming stages, are operating. They may not be operating efficiently or optimizing how they're working together, but they are operating, so not entirely dysfunctional. But of course, the language in terms of, it's sort of Patrick Lencioni's model, if people are familiar with it, around the need to build trust as a foundational aspect, is absolutely key. I think in terms of building leadership team efficiency, it has to be intentional. So early stage businesses, small organic new teams can bond and do a lot until about until the pain points tend to emerge around the 70, 80 at the point of scaling in terms of size. I'm generalizing, of course, but when the pain points start to get more pressured, where you can't communicate with everyone, where you've got to start cascading comms, where you have to be thinking ahead of the curve, not just reacting, all those elements, you do need to be intentional about it. So trust is really important. How do you gain that trust? It's dead easy to say, of course, everyone's got to trust each other. Actually, the role of the COO, a relatively simple attempt at a session on actually what's everyone's personal values and what are the values that resonate with them within the business. So how aligned are they to the company values if they have some? And if not, that could be a starting conversation to try to create them. What behaviors are they noticing? Having a session together, what behaviors are you noticing amongst yourselves as a team? What is working and what's not working? Now, if it's hard to have that session because there isn't the trust there, then you might, as COOs, pick off some of the alignment with that to get to alignment one by one rather than a team session. But of course, starting with your founder would be really key. Certainly not maybe all the issues on the table with the founder, depending on that relationship from the get-go, but the intention that you want to solve for, that you're noticing, even calling out that you're noticing that things aren't optimized in terms of how the team's working is a great step forward. Because you intuitively, as you said, Charlene, you intuitively might know it, but what do you do about it? Actually starting to put it on as, this is one of my projects I'm going to work with as a CEO, as a COO, will get you further, because then you're leaning in to address it. I don't often see these issues being solved naturally without active involvement thereafter. If you notice that there's cracks, you go, oh, well, it'll fix itself when we get our goals clear, or it will fix itself when we hire that new missing C player. It doesn't work like that. In fact, it gets more complicated. So, you know, I guess it's calling out the difficult conversation, really. The other point is why teams might be dysfunctional. I guess three things I notice. One is roles and responsibilities amongst the team might not be clear. You've all done a bit of everything as generalists as you've come into the early stage business. As the business grows, who amongst the leadership team is doing what and who's accountable for what? So that really helps bring that team together. Oh, okay, you're working on that. I'm not working on that. I'll come to you for that topic then. Oh, great, that's off my plate. That's on your, whatever it might be. That's really helpful. Decision making. What meetings, cadence, channels are all being used to help the leadership team make decisions? So which are for discussion and which are for decisions? That can be a game changer. I had a client last year where every leadership team meeting was a discussion, and the frustration was building that decisions were not, they were being made outside the meeting and the discussion was in the meeting, but actually people wanted to know the full decision. And it was all through osmosis, and that was really frustrating for a lot of people, and that didn't help build trust, right? So again, something quite simple. So the decision making. And the third thing is the clarity of communication when a decision's been made. Sounds simple, but log it. I don't know if, I mean, minutes is too formal, perhaps, but who's note-taking about what happens in leadership meetings and who's following up with the actions, and how are we communicating what we're doing next to the business? So these are just trying to think of some practical aspects that might come into helping a leadership team function well.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah. So what I've heard from you is that it's like a combination of kind of what I hesitate to say the softer side, but it's kind of like values alignment and really like, you know, having conversations about like why are we each here? What drove us to join this startup or to found it? You know, and how do we need to work together? But it sounds like there's also some tactical things that we can do, like role clarity, which I think is critical for employee engagement across the whole organization, but no less at the leadership team. As you know, especially in an earlier stage startup, everyone's wearing multiple hats. So it's very easy to collide into each other's swim lanes. And then talking about the importance of communication. And yeah, in one of the startups that I was a COO of, we actually experimented a bit with having a decisions log in Confluence so that there was some transparency around major decisions that were being made and that it would be affecting different teams cross-functionally.
Yeah,
so I love that.
I mean, another example of a client that I've worked with, the leadership team weren't naturally note-taking, or there wasn't a CEO in this business, for example. There was a chief of staff, but actually the consistency of note-taking wasn't there. And actually recognized that the leadership team needed some administrative support. And there's often a lot of, oh, we don't need an EA in the business, I can do my own admin. Absolutely, that's great if you can. But recognize also where you can't, because it's been a game changer. I was talking to the CEO last week. It's been a game changer for how this leadership team works. It's brought the organization they weren't doing naturally themselves. So, yeah.
I know, and how, I mean, that's a simple example of kind of some of the feeling that we feel as operations leaders, is that sometimes like what is seen as mundane or like administrative can actually be one of the most critical functions, right? If you don't document what is being discussed or the decisions that are being made, then you can't properly communicate. So it seems like a administrative task, but it's actually really strategic.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, just to continue a bit, you highlighted or alluded to the fact that your needs can evolve as your company grows, from a smaller startup to a maybe mid to growth. So I'd love to hear, when you start seeing as a ops leader, people issues, broadly speaking, showing up in your organization, is there any rubric or kind of rough advice for how do you know when to like do it yourself? So you just say, okay, we don't have budget, or it's not the right time to hire a chief people officer. I'm just going to drive these as special initiatives, as you suggested, as a COO. When's the time to actually say, okay, I'm managing 5 functions as a COO, like, hey, CEO, we really need to invest in a chief people officer, or like a head of people ops, someone of that caliber, or we say, hey, let's supplement this by outsourcing. So let's partner with High Calibre People or another consulting advisory firm and like get some help, which can also be good because they're a third party and they're a bit more neutral, as opposed to you trying to drive this people agenda when it's like not explicitly your mandate. How do you know, like, when is the right time to do the right in-house, do it with someone, have it outsourced? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, how much? So there's, for you as a COO or as an operations lead, what's your capacity like and what's your capability like? And in a way that helps solve for what you might decide to do. And it's so many shapes and sizes of what I see in the market. But some of the themes might be a trigger point might be that the strategic topics are missing. So all the people stuff and work that you're doing is all operational. So it's contract related, it's visa related, it's employee relations, it's low performance issues, it's sickness, it's COVID leave, it's flexible working. You can go on, right? There's so much in there. If that's where all your, forgive me, the noise is, it may be that you do need someone to be dedicated to solving for it, and importantly to scale, starting to automate your solutions. Because if anyone's on the call and you're still on spreadsheets and you don't have an HR system in place, it is one of the best early investments that you'll make as the business grows. I mean, I don't come across many organizations that are still in that space, because of the growth of HR tech, actually, and the access to cheaper, it's quite simple systems that now are on the market. So you don't have to go complex if you're early stage. But I think the automation piece is key. So if lots of operational noise, get your systems and your HR ops person sorted. And that's perhaps where you'll start. If it is all on the strategic topics, and it is all about, you want to get to the heart of attraction and retention, you might be looking at what's our performance culture, how do we develop our people, how do we progress them, do we need a leveling system in place, have we got the right reward philosophy, all the attraction and engagement and retention levers. Your ops person will know all about them, of course they will, but they might not have built the frameworks just yet, depending on their level, to be able to roll them out. So your third question was, when do you then outsource? Well, where you need the specialism, and quickly. Otherwise, you can organically build something simple and then evolve it and then wait to see how big you get. It's true, but every time you change, like all these things, if you build them better from the start, you can spend less time on them as you grow.
Oh, that's that's music to my ears. We talk a lot as operations folks about, you hear a lot about technical debt or like product debt, which means basically, stuff that you say, oh, we'll build fast, but we'll deal with that later. And I think there's completely the concept of operational debt. And it's really easy in operations to just say, okay, well, we're just going to hack it now and we'll deal with the problems as they come. But we often talk about like building strong foundations operationally. And so we have this philosophy at Operations Nation that the more that you invest in building solid foundations, like you reference systems, we'll talk in a little bit about processes. If you build a culture of, placing a priority on people strategy and people ops early on, then I think it's easier to build upon that later. But if you kind of suddenly, 3 years into your business, wake up and decide you want to do people strategy, I reckon it's probably too late at that point, or it will be a lot harder than if you just started from scratch.
It's a great point, Charlene, because what I see quite often is, and rightly so, I think rightly so, build your foundation so you've got the infrastructure there to scale. And they can spend 2-3 years, it can take 2-3 years to get that. I mean, you have to get it in quickly, but to get the engine properly working, I mean, certainly 18 months, 2 years, but fully oiled. And then once you have that, it does sometimes take organizations 2-3 years before they go, but what is our plan? Or they're working without a plan. And actually, you can have a plan on one slide. This doesn't need to be a white paper. It doesn't need to be a deep document. But the plan is really saying, what are we prioritizing? And actually, what do we want to, and this is the bit that's often missed, I see, what are we communicating to our employees that we want to commit to deliver to you this year? Like, which other function doesn't have a plan that they tell the business what they're doing? But HR is really, really common that they don't have that. They say, okay, this quarter we're going to address, we're working towards salary increases at mid-year. Well, okay, but that is important, but it's tactical. And the employee expectations, as we know, even pre-COVID were high. Never mind post-COVID and the complexity of the working world now. So yeah, I mean, I think I'm a big believer in aligning the leadership team on the plan, because all the leaders have different ideas about what they want to prioritize, let alone what you think is right as the COO. So.
Oh, love that. Yeah, I think one of the most powerful things I learned from, so I want to give a shout out. I don't think she's on this call, but Maddie Fox, who is the Chief People Officer at Lantum, the last company where I was the COO, just really, really espouse the importance of tying people strategy to business strategy. So instead of, as you said, being kind of tactical about what the people team was doing, really tying their goals and their OKRs back to the business strategies. And I thought that was really powerful. And it really signaled to the rest of the business that, hey, we see people strategy as equally important as general business strategy or product strategy or ops strategy. And that, in fact, it is a huge enabler. Like, I see people strategy as almost like the wrapper kind of around everything that we do in a business. And if you don't get that right, then it's really difficult to drive forward change. So that's really helpful.
It's one of the benefits of actually the COOs having an involvement in the people function, is because you are naturally all commercial. Not every HR person has a commercial mindset. So actually, some of the challenges in the market when hiring your more senior people leaders for some founders or early stage CEOs is finding the ones that are commercial enough, not just built. So there's a whole nuance there too.
Amazing. Well, Janie, so helpful. I think this is a great segue actually to, and as a caveat to our audience, we knew that this is kind of like opening up Pandora's box. So our vision was not really to cover, every single people operations topic or, be able to drill down into each one. But Janie and I have agreed to kind of highlight a few different topics that I think are really important based on my experience, and hopefully will be helpful to y'all. So one is around org design. And I think this is a great segue because, what often COOs and ops leaders do is we're the glue that keeps a business together. And often, yes, we're thinking about the functions that directly report into us, but we're also looking at operational efficiency across the entire org. And a huge enabler of that is effective org design. But often and I mean, I'm speaking for myself, like I wasn't trained in organizational design, obviously by experience, like we have to build org charts, we manage our own org charts within a team. Like there's some intuition around it, but we're not necessarily org design specialists. So I'd love to hear, like, what advice would you give to those of us who aren't formally trained in org design, but we're trying to drive this or support our CEOs and leadership teams to drive wider org design? And then as a follow-up question, one of the questions that we really want to address is this idea of silos. So it'd be great if you could also address, like, how do we do all of this org design without just doing this, perfunctory, lovely symmetrical org chart, but that basically creates silos, which may add actually and create dysfunction at the leadership team level, which is where we started our conversation. So that's a lot, but yeah, basically advice for driving org design when you aren't trained in it, and then how do we avoid silos?
Well, I mean, when you originally asked the question, even the fact that org design is on the agenda, honestly, that's great to hear, because I see a lot of early stage businesses talking just about hiring plans, not even headcount plans, and the distinction, obviously the difference between the two. I mean, org design, maybe some broad statements, but org design is an evolution. You never stop doing org design because the company is continually changing. So when you think, great, I've done it, there's the chart, the leaders of those functional areas should be constantly thinking about how their teams are delivering, growing, developing, what skills they're missing, etc. So it's definitely evolutionary. Org design should also always be proactive. So the fact that you can think ahead of, okay, this is what we look like today. A key question is actually, what do we want to look like in the next 6 months? And that hopefully is linked to your 12-month plan out, assuming the business has that. Now, they don't always have a plan that's 12 months out, maybe linked to runway challenges, maybe linked to perhaps another round coming up, wherever it may be. But as far out as you can go, thinking, what is the shape of the org that we need? Back to your pretty pictures, org design principles around what's the breadth of the span of control is the language that they use in org design that you want someone to have versus how many layers should be in the organization. The span of control really is the get clear on the roles and responsibilities of each person, of each role that they're covering, and make sure that role and responsibility is linked to the work that you want to deliver. So an example might be you have someone in your team that is I was talking to a business this week about their customer engagement team, their CRM team, and let's say they were only email CRM before, and the person in the team is only email CRM. But actually the business wants to radically change its retention approaches. Actually, well, what skills are you missing? What level of people do you need in the team? Just even thinking around the capability and level of person you think you need, with a caution of going, I can't do the broad brush statement, but getting the right balance of experienced versus delivery, that span of expertise in the right blend for your business. There is a trap that sometimes companies fall in with saying, if I hire senior, every problem goes away. Now, if you've got good budgets to play with, it's not a bad policy to start with, because the leader of that team can be game changing to how that team operates. And in fact, the opposite way is if you've got a leader that's underperforming, that team is unlikely to perform. So the strength of the leader in that team is really key. So there's the spans of control, the layers, having a strong leader, how many reports does any one person have? I mean, you can do the 1 of 6, 1 of 7, 1 of 8, probably max, depending on size of business. You could be smaller, if you want to have, if your business is heavily customer oriented, you might have more junior managers. It really depends on the shape of your business. But in a recent project with a client, actually, from the shaping work that we've done, we're going, well, actually, how does that compare in the market? So I went out to, a whole bunch of people in my network and built them a benchmark. Well, this is how other companies of the same size are structured. Actually, this is where you sit. But that's why these businesses might be different. And it just prompted the right conversation. And I think just the other point around linking to org design or linking into talent that I see a lot is when a funding round comes in, or where you're in hiring mode, is people hire without properly defining the role. And I've had many debates with different leaders around hire for talent over hire for the role. Whichever way round you want to do it, know the work that they're going to work on. Because your org, by the time those people are in, your org will have changed again. And whilst you want to shuffle them around different projects, no problem, but at least you can take the employee through that conversation. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So many pearls of wisdom here. Thank you so much for that. I mean, hearing from you, kind of forecasting. So kind of at a macro level, thinking about where does the company need to be in 6 to 12 months. And I couldn't agree more. It's really difficult to kind of have a leadership team develop hiring plans, much less think about like, the evolution of your function when you're not clear on like where the company is going, right? Because the business needs should drive very much like the org design. You've talked about tactical things like really looking at span of control, understanding the skills and capabilities that are, either present in the team or missing, or you need to boost out. And then, oh my goodness, I couldn't stop nodding my head when you're talking about role clarity. I'm guilty of this too. And I wonder if anyone else on the call has done this before. You're just in a hustle. You need to hire 20 people yesterday, or actually like 6 months ago. And so you're just trying to like get these job adverts out, but not really thinking through like, what are they going to be responsible for when they join? What do they need to grow into? And so I think for me as a COO, it's always this tension of, it's like the angel and the devil on your shoulders, right? Like the devil's just saying like, deal with your short-term needs, like deal with now and yesterday. And it's very short-term thinking. And the angel is kind of this voice of reason that's saying, hey, slow down, take a minute or two and think about where do we need this team to be, within my function or across the wider business. Yeah. So really, really helpful. Well, thank you. So in the interest of time, I think I'd like to go to the last section of our conversation, which is really around the different aspects of the employee journey and what phases of the employee journey you think are most important to build processes around as we scale our businesses. And also, I want to acknowledge, I've seen a couple of questions come in through Q&A, which I think will be easier to integrate into this section of the conversation. So I will draw those in. So thank you to folks who have put Ilaria and Florence, your questions, and please feel free to drop in Q&A as we draw to a close on this conversation. So yeah, going back to this employee journey, and for those of y'all, this is probably obvious, you mentioned some of them, but kind of there's the acquisition piece. So employer brand, making sure that you can attract talent to your business, the actual recruitment process, then onboarding once you've made those, got those amazing accepted offers. There's everything that happens to you in your journey, like, professional development, the learning and development you said, performance management, progression, hopefully promotions or exciting lateral moves, whatever that is. And then of course, although we'd love to work for our startups for forever, maybe there's a time when it comes time to leave. And so kind of like the offboarding process and termination, et cetera. So we'd just love to hear, I know this is such a big question, but what advice do you have for like knowing when to focus on what aspects of the employee journey, depending on the size of your business?
Okay, so look, however small the business is, however big it is, the attraction, retention, and engagement of your teams are critical, whether they're small teams, whether they're large teams. I think when I think about your question, there's probably broadly two phases. If I was trying to be really binary, actually, there's probably two phases that I see that the work into, the work buckets it flows into. Phase one is you've got to be able to hire well, as you say. And I don't think the relabeling of talent acquisition from recruitment teams is any coincidence, right? Recruiting is much more than just the recruitment process, as you're alluding to. And the galvanizing of internal support for employer branding is something that's often missed too. It's actually just the recruiter posts, recruiter develops the right meetups, recruiter does this. Actually, this should be in the bones of the business. So actually talent acquisition is really key. Onboarding, as you mentioned, a V1 of onboarding can be really light and effective, is what I would say with onboarding. Doesn't have to be over egged until the business becomes more sophisticated. Same with performance management. And even when the business becomes more, bigger, 200, 250 plus, I would say, performance management, everybody's always rightly fearful that it's going to become administratively heavy and overburdening. But actually, you can keep performance management light if your leaders can develop, and your managers actually can develop your natural skills for listening, developing, coaching, supporting, etc. So talent acquisition, onboarding, performance management, and rewards and leveling. These are non-negotiables in your first level. Now, I can hear some HR colleagues probably challenging me on leveling, going, if you're a 30-person business, you don't need leveling in place. Well, that's true. You don't need a deep leveling structure, but indicatively starting to define what your expectations are from a low, mid, and upper level at its most simple basis is really useful as you build out your TA, as you build out your hiring. So you can start to think, okay, back to your org design, what level? People think of levels as numbers and sub-levels and sub-factors. Like at its most simple level, what level of person do you want? Do you want a junior, mid, or senior? So that's quite just a useful discipline. Again, sounds obvious, but I don't hear it that often. And then the phase two, and I say it a bit reluctantly with this one around phase two, I put in management and leadership development, because I'm a really big believer on getting your management development right to allow your company to properly scale. So one of the biggest barriers as you get to 250, 300 plus, that if your managers are not great managers, everything sits with your leaders and your leaders can't be strategic. And I'm using loose numbers. You might find this already in a 150-person business, but how do you go from being that functional leader to that strategic leader? And then the culture, values, and behaviors. You don't do that first off. You start the company, you go, what are our values? Well, you don't know, you haven't started operating yet. So for me, values and behaviors are all about what is the everyday behaviors you're showing up with, and then put the labels around them. Obviously to make sure they're right with where your business wants to go. But in the market today, find me any company that differentiates its values. I mean, they're all certainly in tech, they're all very similar. Yeah, so that would broadly, if that's helpful, sort of broadly two phases.
Amazing. I am having the reaction of, oh my goodness, there's a lot in phase one. So I wonder if there's some audience members who are like, oh, that's a lot. But hey, I mean, that's what we're built to do. And that's, I think, part of the fabric of being a great operations leader is that you have to juggle a heck of a lot of things, a heck of a lot of functions, a bunch of people. And you also have to be thinking about a lot of different processes. But I did want to, and I'm also reflecting a little bit, which will take some time to process on your second statement about values. And even we at Operations Nation, we're like relatively early. I mean, we're 2 years in, but starting to articulate our values and basically the behaviors and stuff that we want to see and how we work together as we've expanded to include new team members. So shout out to Becca and Despina for joining our team. But yeah, I think there is the assumption that you kind of have to set that, and everybody pulls up the giant Netflix values deck and tries to like create their own. And so, yeah, I'll have to process a little bit about the timing of that, because I think that is something that we have felt important to articulate, but completely agree. It has to evolve, because otherwise, I think this would hold true to all processes, is like before you actually operate in any capacity, you're hypothesizing what's going to work or what isn't. I mean, that's the nature of startups. Like when you don't have customers, you don't know how they're going to, react. So it's hard to push for amazing net promoter score if you don't even really know what pleases your customers, right?
I mean, leaders,
okay.
the worst, of course, we all know with values, if the leaders are not living the behaviors that you've set out to say you're going to do, and they're unauthentic, culturally, you're on a backward roll.
Yeah,
so
for
that's
sure.
The main reason is live them and then define them.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I'm processing on that. And then I'd love to just throw in, as we draw closer to the top of the hour, a couple of the questions that came up. And I think this is a really good one to land on, because, you referenced the importance of having strong people managers, but we find in a lot of our startups that we are basically turning we're creating first-time people managers. They're not only doing a function, but now they're having to learn how to be great people managers. So we just love to hear this is a two-part question. So one is like, what advice or resources do you have, for those of us who are like basically trying to mentor or train up first-time people managers? And then I guess a second part of that question is, how do we know when to kind of centralize those people processes and like do it top down and be like, okay, I as de facto chief people officer am going to dictate, how you onboard people and set the processes, quote unquote, top down, versus like letting your often first time people managers do that bottom up and customize to their team or function.
Yeah, I mean, so the second part of your question first, perhaps process is about creating efficiency. So actually, if there's comparative similarities amongst the different processes at a functional level, then centralize, because then you get efficiency across the whole organization. But I definitely see and would be an advocate for having functional uniqueness to those processes. So get as much of this is broadly how we want to work.
Mm-hmm.
Your product and tech hiring processes will be different to that of hiring a recruiter.
Of course.
So, etc. And the same with progression, and actually the same with development. There's a personalization to their learning journeys and tech that's unique to that of the rest of the organization. So there's lots within that, but I would say you want to centralize for efficiency and for scaling and automation as much as possible. The first part of your question, I think, was how do you help first-time leaders, first-time managers become leaders? I mean, this is a lot to do with your own leadership style. If you at the outset, what are the values and that you bring in terms of wanting to work with that leader and communicate them? Look, what's important to me when I manage is X, right through to here's a great book. And I always quote The Making of a Manager, the Julie Zhu book for first-time leaders. It just gives you really clearly the best tips for actually how you, from your first one-to-one right through to actually how do you do your performance reviews. So it's just a neat read, or whichever, so many books out there, but giving them the right resources to just softly land them into the role. But if you've got multiple managers and you want to get some unity between how they're all operating to set the expectations, perhaps linking to the values of the business or the culture of the business, then you bring in some management development training, right? So, and what I would say there is, and I help companies facilitate this, is purely off the shelf, you'll get the off the shelf delivery. But if you can help tailor that training to really the issues that are going on in your business at that point, I hope that it would be longer lasting in terms of outcome. But just because they've been in the training doesn't mean they're going to be a great manager, but they'll have the toolkit to work with. And that's what they're missing when they first transition from an IC, an individual contributor, to a manager.
I love that. So much to say more on that. And we will definitely share some of the resources that you've mentioned, and then maybe add some that we've come across as well. That would be helpful. So thanks for that question, Florence. And then last one, we'll keep this brief, if you don't mind. So this is a data question, which I love. So as a people ops manager, and I think this would apply to a lot of us, what is the kind of data that we should start gathering or prioritize in general? And I guess I'm assuming this is related to people data. So that could be any data along the employee journey.
We've got 1 minute for this. So whoever's asked it, if they want to email me later, I can happily have an exchange with them, because it's obviously much bigger. But firstly, your people data on your system, or a spreadsheet, but your system needs to be accurate and clean. So we have lots of data in the system, but it's not updated and it's not relevant. The data that you do want to have is everything from your talent acquisition data. So the metrics that you would go with your TA. You want to have some form of engagement data through any survey work that you would do. You want to have performance data if you have any metrics for performance. You would have level data in there as well, what level they are in the organization. You would have, generally speaking, gender. So you're ensuring, if you're focusing on diversity and inclusion, that you can have a view on where you are today. And that's all on top of assuming you've got your org structure data in there. So lots of discussion around, are you calling a department, a function, is it sub-functions, is it sub-teams? But whatever the granularity of the org structure that you have in your business, you want to represent at a data level, so that you can cut your data any which way thereafter. And then rewards data, of course, and all the components of rewards, because even especially with the current economic climate, everything we're looking at in reward is around total package, not just base salary. So I'll stop there, but it's a huge question.
Oh, I know, so much to discuss, but thank you for making that brief. So we're at the top of the hour, but I can't resist. We always love to do these Brene Brown inspired rapid fire questions. So I'm just going to keep it to one as a closing parting shot, and then I'll do kind of wrap up. Fill in the blank. People leadership is?
It's hard. It's hard. It's hard in a remote world. It's hard in the working world that we've got. It takes time investment. It takes commitment. It takes good comm skills. There's a whole bunch in there, but just empathetically saying to you all, people leadership isn't easy. It's probably lots of what I hear about from first-time leaders as they're learning. You have to invest in it to be good at it.
Love that. Well, that's encouragement to anybody on the call who's either formally in a people leadership role or someone who's motivated or inspired to play more of an active role. It's hard. And I think that's why we're driving this conversation, and we'll continue to do so, because we want to equip y'all, to do some of this hard work, but important work. So with that said, a huge thank you, Janie. Your wisdom, your insight, which has come from both being an operator yourself, as well as someone who's providing leadership, coaching and supporting services to startups and scale-ups. Can't thank you enough. And a huge thank you to all of you who took time this morning, before you're starting your days, to listen in. We hope that the conversation has been helpful, has given you some food for thought, and we want to continue the conversation. So please keep in touch with us. We have an active LinkedIn page, so please follow us if you don't already. And we encourage you to check out the many resources which we've aggregated on our website, which is here on the slide, www.operationsnation.com, where you can also subscribe to our monthly newsletter. And last, but certainly not least, we want to let y'all know, if you haven't already heard, we are organizing our second annual conference, which is loosely scheduled for October of this year. And we are looking for panelists and speakers, as well as sponsors who are interested in supporting us on this journey. So stay tuned for more on that, but please do reach out. We're always reachable at hello@operationsnation.com. And we look forward to seeing you at the next conversation. Have a great day.